Welcome back to our study of the Law of Moses. Today we're going to venture into a new topic. We're going to start talking about family law. So laws in the Law of Moses concerning sexuality, marriage, inheritance, and some other things. But we're going to be focusing on those three. We'll start with sexuality today, and then we'll pass into family law, marriage and divorce, laws concerning those things, and then we'll finish up with inheritance. Now, unlike with the cleanliness laws that we covered last week, I'm not going to try to do this all in one shot. The video editing is a beast for once you get to the lengths that we got to last week. So I'm going to try to keep this one shorter, and we're going to begin talking about what the law has to say about sexuality. Now, as we study in the law, we're going to see that these principles in the law concerning sexuality connect back to some of the other topics that we're studying. We'll see marriage and sexuality connect back to laws about cleanliness, and even the laws concerning worship and sacrifice. We'll see some important connections there. We're also going to see the laws about marriage segue us into laws about property, right? Because property is primarily handled in the marriage context. Right, so there are plenty of laws in the ancient world and in the Law of Moses concerning inheritance, and that is the primary means by which property is held in the ancient world, including in Israel. So we're going to just jump right in, and we're going to begin talking about sex in the ancient world. Now, all cultures throughout history have regulated sexuality. Right? There's no such thing as a sustained, unrestricted hedonism on a culture-wide level in antiquity. Right? It's unheard of. There's always some kind of restriction on sex. For example, adultery was harshly punished in pretty much every culture in antiquity. Now, of course, their understanding of adultery differs somewhat from the biblical understanding of adultery. Their purpose for including these laws is different than what we're going to see in the Law of Moses. But adultery is one really solid example of how ancient cultures were very concerned with restricting sexual activity. You can see it through multiple different cultures in the ancient Near East. And in fact, we'll take some examples from some pagan law codes in antiquity. All of these that we're going to be quoting predate the Law of Moses by quite some time. But you'll see some similarities, right? As you listen to the laws, you'll start to get a sense for the ancient Near Eastern way of looking at things, and hopefully it will also help us pick out the distinctives that we're going to see in the Law of Moses. What makes the Law of Moses different from all of these other ancient Near Eastern law codes. We're going to be reading, starting today, from law collections from Mesopotamia and Asia Minor. This is a collection that is put together by Martha T. Roth. You can get this, I think I picked this up on Amazon. It's published by the Society of Biblical Literature. This has been a very handy volume for me to have in my own personal study of the law, because a lot of the things that you find written about in the Law of Moses were written about in these other laws as well. And it's interesting to compare and see how God leads Israel through Moses into moral truth, where you see some of the other ancient cultures approaching things quite differently. We're going to start with a passage from the Laws of Eshnunna. Eshnunna was an 18th century, we're talking 18th century before Christ, an 18th century civilization. Eshnunna was a city just northeast of present-day Baghdad. And this is what the Laws of Eshnunna have to say about adultery. If he concludes the contract and the nuptial feast for her father and mother, and he marries her, she is indeed a wife. The day she is seized in the lap of another man, she shall die. She will not live. Right, as we're going to see, this is normal for the ancient Near Eastern laws. adultery, that is a married woman engaging in fornication with another man, almost always leads to death. Right, now, in different law codes, you will see some exceptions made for different circumstances. Right, and as we study the law, we're going to get into some specific situations where, depending on circumstances, one party might be put to death, the other party might live. Different circumstances reverse those punishments. But it is normal in the ancient world that if a married woman is caught fornicating with a man who is not her husband, that one or both of them is going to be put to death. All right, we also see this reflected in the laws of Hammurabi. So we'll take a reading from there. You'll see a slightly different twist taken to this law as we read from the laws of Hammurabi. If a man's wife should be seized lying with another male, they shall bind them and cast them into the water. If the wife's master allows his wife to live, then the king shall allow his subject, in other words, the other male, to live. All right, so same punishment. Right, you have a married woman caught in the act of fornicating with another man, and at least Hammurabi prescribes death for both of them if, well, ultimately it comes down to the woman's husband. He gets to choose the punishment for his wife, and whatever he chooses for his wife, the king is also going to apply to the man that she was fornicating with. So if the husband chooses mercy, then the fornicator, the other man, also receives mercy. If the husband chooses death for his wife, then the other man is also put to death. And we're going to pull just one more example, this from the Middle Assyrian laws. And just get ready, the Middle Assyrian laws are different. You'll see. I want to bring this example out because it's a good example of how the ancients came up with laws for some really specific scenarios. Right, so the two laws that we've looked at from Eshnunna and from Hammurabi, those are pretty generic. But several of the law codes come up with some really specific circumstances for how the act of adultery could be carried out. So we're going to turn to the Middle Assyrian laws, and we're going to consider a very specific situation that is legislated there. If a man's wife should take another man's wife into her house and give her to a man for purposes of fornication, and the man knows that she is the wife of a man, they shall treat him as one who has fornicated with the wife of another man. And they treat the female procurer just as the woman's husband treats his fornicating wife. And if the woman's husband intends to do nothing to his fornicating wife, they shall do nothing to the fornicator or to the female procurer. They shall release them. But if the man's wife does not know what was intended, and the woman who takes her into her house brings the man into her by deceit, and he then fornicates with her, if as soon as she leaves the house she should declare that she has been the victim of fornication, they shall release the woman, she is clear. They shall kill the fornicator and the female procurer. But if the woman should not so declare, the man shall impose whatever punishment on his wife he wishes. They shall kill the fornicator and the female procurer. All right, so you can see that the Middle Assyrian laws add several layers of complexity to the situation. They're looking at a specific circumstance where a woman lures another married woman in to commit fornication with another man, and it looks at two different circumstances there. On the one hand, you have one where all parties involved know what they're doing, right? And then the circumstance is very similar to what we read in Hammurabi. The victim, the husband who was cheated on, gets the choice of what's going to happen to all of them. His wife, the man who fornicated with her, and the woman who procured his wife for the other man. He gets to decide all of their fate, but it's going to be the same, just like we saw in Hammurabi. Now, that's one circumstance. If, on the other hand, the wife is lured in by the woman, taken unsuspectingly, and then fornication occurs, then, if she makes a report about it, it's treated as a case of rape. And so the fornicator is put to death, and the woman who lured the wife in is put to death, but the wife herself is let go. I bring that up also because we're going to see that come up over and over again once we consider rape in the law, because rape is covered in the law of Moses, and there are lots of specific applications of those laws throughout Israel's history. And you'll see that the matter of a report is very important. Right? But you see, the ancients, they weren't simpletons about it. Right? They had some sense that they're looking at potentially complex situations where they need to differentiate between one circumstance and another, and they need to do so justly, right? So if the wife was lured in and taken against her will, it would be unjust to put her to death, right? And the ancients recognized that. Even the Middle Assyrian laws recognized that, and the Middle Assyrian laws are typically pretty harsh. Right? I mean, there are other places. In fact, we might even read some of these in other parts of our study of the law of Moses. But there are laws in the Middle Assyrian laws that involve your lips getting cut off with the blade of an axe. I mean, they're very, very colorful laws. We got to give them that. Now, the law of Moses provides something for Israel that other cultures in antiquity already had, right? Sexual restrictions. But the law of Moses does so in a way that teaches about God's holiness and about the nature of the created order. And you'll see that the way that Moses treats sexuality is different from the way that Eshnunna or Hammurabi or the Middle Assyrian laws treat adultery and other forms of sexuality. But the law, to start off with, gives Israel something that is distinct from the sexual laws of their pagan neighbors. We find this in the beginning of Leviticus chapter 18. We'll read the first 5 verses there. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan to which I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. You shall follow my rules, and keep my statutes, and walk in them. I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my rules. If a person does them, he shall live by them. I am the Lord. Now this passage occurs as the opening to a long set of sexual restrictions in Leviticus 18 that we're going to read just a little later on. But notice what the basis for all of it is. It's God's holiness. He says, you're going to be different. You're going to be different than Egypt. You're going to be different than the Canaanites. You're not going to follow their laws in this regard. You're going to follow my laws, and you're going to remain holy to me. So these laws that we're going to read are not arbitrary, like we talked about last week. Like the cleanliness laws, they are moral laws. They're not just made up because God is capricious and enjoys seeing people not having fun and having to live under restrictions. They have a purpose to them. Now, unlike some of the cleanliness laws that we studied last week, a lot of these sexual laws are not just training wheels, as it were, in moral teaching. All right, we saw that as we considered, for example, the passage from Mark, where Jesus considers what defiles a person. It's not what comes inside the person from without, it is what comes from within the person that defiles him. Right? And there Mark tells us explicitly that Jesus declares all foods clean. Right? So the dietary laws and a lot of the cleanliness laws function as training wheels in moral teaching. The sexual laws are not like that. In fact, in the very same passage in Mark, Jesus includes sexual immorality in his list of defilements that come from within. Right? So these sexual laws are not suspended or modified in any way in the New Testament. with some, well, we'll see some exceptions later on. The New Testament is usually pretty clear where it wants to make exceptions and modifications. A lot of the things that we're going to study today out of Leviticus 18, we do not find suspended or modified in the New Testament. So, one thing, as we enter into today's study, we need to keep a fact in mind that I think is, at least it's uncomfortable for me to think about this. Remember that laws are written for a purpose. Laws are written for people and with people in mind, especially in the ancient world. In the modern world, it's more common to see blue laws where you have some busybody just, oh, you're not allowed to jaywalk or spit in the street. And I'm not going to say that those are worthless laws, by the way. There are better examples than that. You don't find anything like that in the ancient world, though, right? You don't find busybodies just multiplying laws out of the rear end because they've got nothing better to do. Law codes in the ancient world are compact because they have to be, right? Because they are set in clay, they're set in stone. There are not a whole lot of people that know how to read and write, so they have to be something that's concise. And so in the ancient world, if somebody comes up with a law, it's for a reason. Generally, a law's inclusion in an ancient law code tells us something about what those ancient people were actually doing. And you'll see what I mean as we read through our text, what I mean by that's an uncomfortable fact that we need to remember. We're going to start, though, with creation principles, because that's usually where the law of Moses begins. We saw it with the cleanliness laws last week, and we certainly see it with sexuality laws in the law of Moses. Let's go back together to Genesis chapter 1, and we're going to see that just even in the midst of creation, that has it tells us a lot about God's intention for sexuality and marriage. So we're going to start in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Now the first thing that we notice is that the law offers a binary view of sex. Whenever God creates humanity, he creates humanity as two sexes, male and female. No more and no less. The next thing that we should notice in the following verse is that the very first commandment that God gives to man is a sexual commandment. All right, let's read in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. And God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So this is placed in the context of God's own creative activity, right? We've just watched him in Genesis 1 filling creation, right? He starts out by making everything, giving everything form, but it's still all empty until he starts filling it with creatures, right? He makes all the birds of the heavens, he makes the things that swarm in the waters, he makes the creatures that roam on the dry land, and he finishes off by creating man, and then commanding man to create more of himself in order to fill and dominate the creation. Right? So everything else he already fills creation with, but with man, he starts off small, and the filling is part of the commandment. Right? Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, God tells humanity. So right out of the gate, we learn that sex is a co-creative act, that sex participates in God's creative act. Right, now we're going to learn later on in the law that sex has some other theological implications as well. But it's important to notice just right out of the gate that sex is really important to the created order. And so, of course, the law of Moses is not going to leave it unregulated. God is not going to be silent about it. He has restrictions for it. He has a direction for it because he has an intention for it. Now, the creation account also introduces marriage as the context for sex. We read that at the end of Genesis chapter 2. We're going to start in verse 23. Then the man said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." Right. And we remember this episode from Genesis 2. God brings all of the animals in front of Adam, and Adam names all of them, but as he has this whole parade of animals coming by him, he finds that there's no suitable helper among the animals for him. There's no partner for him among the animals. And so God puts Adam to sleep, takes the rib out of his side, fashions a woman out of the rib, and presents the woman to Adam. And what we read was Adam's reaction to meeting Eve for the first time. Now, that whole episode shows that the sexes are complementary to each other, that they're made for each other, right? That to use Rocky's formulation of it, she has gaps, I have gaps, together we fill gaps. Now, implied in all of this is a rejection of bestiality and of other sexual behaviors that we're going to see in the law of Moses. Right? That's kind of the whole point of bringing all of those animals by Adam. There is not a suitable partner among the animals for him. Right? So just right out of the gate, bestiality is out of the question. Right? And God does not present Adam with another man. He presents Adam with a woman fashioned from his side, complementary to him. So with that said, let us go ahead and shift our attention to the laws that we find in the law codes of the law of Moses. We find sexual restrictions placed throughout the law. And for the purposes of today's study, we're going to focus on what I think is the most extensive and most restrictive set of laws, which we find in Leviticus chapter 18. So turn there, and we're going to begin in verse 6, and we're going to read through the end of the chapter. "None of you shall approach any one of his close relatives to uncover nakedness. I am the Lord. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is your father's nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your sister, your father's daughter, or your mother's daughter, whether brought up in the family or in another home. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your son's daughter, or of your daughter's daughter, for their nakedness is your own nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife's daughter, brought up in your father's family, since she is your sister. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's sister, she is your father's relative. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your mother's sister, for she is your mother's relative. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's brother, that is, you shall not approach his wife, she is your aunt. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your daughter-in-law, she is your son's wife. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife, it is your brother's nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of a woman and of her daughter, and you shall not take her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter to uncover her nakedness. They are relatives. It is depravity. And you shall not take a woman as a rival wife to her sister, uncovering her nakedness while her sister is still alive. You shall not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness while she is in her menstrual uncleanness. And you shall not lie sexually with your neighbor's wife, and so make yourself unclean with her. You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Molech, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. You shall not lie with any animal, and so make yourself unclean with it. Neither shall any woman give herself to an animal to lie with it. It is perversion. Do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things, for by all these the nations I am driving out before you have become unclean, and the land became unclean, so that I punished its iniquity, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you shall keep my statutes and my rules, and do none of these abominations, either the native or the stranger who sojourns among you. For the people of the land who were before you did all these abominations, so that the land became unclean, lest the land vomit you out when you make it unclean, as it vomited out the nation that was before you. For everyone who does any of these abominations, the persons who do them shall be cut off from among their people. So keep my charge never to practice any of these abominable customs that were practiced before you, and never to make yourselves unclean by them. I am the Lord your God. Now, before we get into discussing any of this in detail, the law might strike us as being overly complex. Right? Why not just write, look, only have sex with your spouse, and just do away with all of the specifics, right? You could boil that chapter down into like one sentence. At least you would think. But we need to remember, if a law is there in an ancient law code, it's written for somebody. Right? The law addresses things that actually happen. So why do we find specific restrictions against incest, against menstrual sex, against adultery, against sacrifice to Molech, against homosexuality, against bestiality? Some of those things might just be plainly just unthinkable to us. And some of those things have been unthinkable for the vast majority of cultures through human history. So why bring them up? Why have to have a specific restriction that says, hey, don't do that? Well, it's because Israel was engaging in those things. And we've got plenty of evidence for that, right? In the law itself and elsewhere in the histories of Israel. All right, now, as we're thinking about these restrictions and as we recognize they are put there because people are engaged in those acts, the question we've got to ask ourselves is just, why Israel? Right? Especially with, let's start with the first section of Leviticus 18, what we just read. The first section deals with incest, and it is by far the lengthiest section out of what we've just read. And for it to be that detailed, that specific, to take up that much real estate, you just got to shake your head. You got to ask yourself, Israel, what on earth are you doing? Now, for our part, we need to remember that modernity has spoiled us for choice, right? This is one instance where our lack of understanding is just a matter of modernity being so different from antiquity, at least in some regards. Right? Modern technology has absolutely spoiled us for choice when it comes to mates, when it comes to partners, spouses. Right? It doesn't mean that in the modern world finding a spouse is necessarily easier. Right? In fact, in some ways, it may even be harder to find a spouse to actually settle down with and make a family with. But in the modern world, we have a much wider pool of mates. Right? We've got access to a huge selection of mates in the modern world. Right? My own marriage is a prime example of that. My wife and I grew up separated by hundreds of miles. And each of us had no idea that the other one existed until we met at college, which was itself hundreds of miles away from either of the places where we grew up. Now, do you think that kind of thing was common in the ancient world? Not at all. Most people in the ancient world, and in fact, most people through human history up until very recently, most people lived and died in the same place where they were born. You didn't move around much. Cases of big migrations are exceptional, which is why they're typically recorded in ancient history. And this is more restrictive than you might even think. Right? You might be thinking, okay, well, what would it be like if I had to choose a spouse just from the people that I knew growing up as a kid? That still might be a pretty broad selection of people for you, especially if you grew up in a city. I grew up out in the middle of nowhere, but even for me, that's a relatively broad selection compared to what people had in the ancient world, because you have to consider that there's another difference between modernity and antiquity. Who do you think you lived around in the ancient world? Who were your neighbors? How was Israel settled in the Promised Land? Not just willy-nilly, however they wanted. They were settled by tribe and by clan, meaning that your neighbors were your relatives. Most ancient people were settled in this way, by the way. This is not something that's distinctive to Israel. For most people in antiquity, the people that you lived around were people that you were related to. So what were your options for marriage? They were almost all people in your family. Now, the ancients saw some perks in this arrangement, too. They weren't too bothered by this in a lot of cases. Think back to modern relationships for a moment. One of the most fraught elements of a modern relationship is introducing your significant other to your parents, and vice versa, right? Who knows if they're going to get along with each other, if they're going to like each other. There's almost this expectation that the significant other is going to be an unknown, right? If you are, if you're a parent and you've got a son or a daughter who's coming of that age, there's basically this expectation in modernity that you have no idea who your son or daughter is going to bring home. And there's going to be a kind of a trial period where you're getting to know the other person and trying to figure out, based on really limited knowledge, is this person a suitable spouse for my son or daughter? You don't have that in the ancient world, by and large, because marrying within the clan is its own form of quality control. We see this reflected in a couple of places in the Law of Moses, in the story of the patriarchs. Go to Genesis chapter 24. We're going to read the first 4 verses and see what Abraham does there. Now Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he had, "Put your hand under my thigh, that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and God of the earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell, but will go to my country and to my kindred, and take a wife for my son Isaac." Now, that's the story of the rest of Genesis 24, is this servant fulfilling this oath. He travels back to Abraham's family in Paddan Aram, and he finds a suitable spouse out of Abraham's clan for Isaac to marry. Abraham doesn't want Isaac marrying any foreign women, right? Even though they do happen to be the ones living just right by Abraham at the time. So Isaac ends up marrying Rebekah, a cousin. Rebekah, in turn, has exactly the same concern for her son Jacob just a couple of chapters later in the story, because we read that Esau, the older twin, marries foreign women, and Rebekah and Isaac both absolutely hate it. Rebekah especially. These foreign women torment their in-laws. And so Rebekah has that same concern for Jacob that Abraham had for Isaac. Don't let Jacob marry one of these foreign women. We need him to marry someone who is known, someone from within our own clan, that is our own family. So Isaac approves of sending Jacob to find a wife from within the family. And so Jacob goes to Paddan Aram, and that's how he finds Rachel and Leah. Right, and that's its whole other story. But that's twice, right, in just quick succession, that we see this principle in play, that at least from the ancient perspective, it makes a whole lot of sense to marry within the family. Not necessarily, we're not talking like brother and sister, we're talking cousins, sometimes separated by a few generations. Although, well, look, if that is the norm for you, then it is possible for you to become more comfortable with the thought of closer relations being suitable for sex and marriage. So, why does the law forbid sexual relations between parents and their children, or between siblings and or between half siblings? Well, we know that those sorts of things happened in the ancient world. They happened among the patriarchs, and they happened in Israel. But we've got examples of all of these things. We've got the example of what Ham did to Noah after the flood in Genesis chapter 9. And I feel like I need to take a second with that. You might be scratching your head. Remember the language of that passage. Moses tells us that Ham saw his father's nakedness. Now, we should recognize that language from the text that we've just read in Leviticus 18. What's the euphemism that Moses uses over and over and over again to talk about sexual impurity? It's uncovering someone's nakedness. And at least in Leviticus 18, we're not under any kind of misconception about what that means. We know we're talking about sex. In Genesis 9, let me suggest that we're meant to understand that Ham took advantage of Noah as Noah was lying passed out drunk in his tent. That's the crime that Ham commits, and that's the reason why his son Canaan is cursed. But we also have the example of Abraham and Sarah. This one is especially rich because we understand from Abraham explaining it to Abimelech that Abraham and Sarah are half-siblings, but they're married. And this wasn't uncommon in the ancient world. We just read a prohibition against it in the law of Moses. But before the law of Moses, in the ancient world, it's not uncommon for you to find half-siblings being married to each other. And Abraham takes advantage of that situation. He only counts the two of them as half-siblings when it's convenient for him, right? Normally, Sarah is his wife, but whenever he enters new territory and he's afraid for his life, then Sarah becomes his sister, right? Notice the way that he expresses that. He does it to Pharaoh earlier on in Genesis. He does it to Abimelech. He doesn't say, oh, Sarah's my half-sibling who happens to be my wife. He just says, she's my sister. And so Sarah ends up being defiled. Right? And so Abraham's abuse of that system it's particularly rich. We have other examples as well. We have the example of Lot with his daughters in Genesis 19. Later in Israel's history, we have the example of Amnon and Tamar, who are half-siblings. So we have all of these restrictions going on because we know that these are things that are happening in Israel, just as they happened among the patriarchs. The law also forbids marrying sisters as rival wives. Who does that sound like? Who does that remind you of? Right, now, in Israel's situation, that kind of marriage was probably more common than just the prominent example of Jacob marrying Rachel and Leah. There's a lot of motive in the ancient world for a man to end up marrying two sisters. Right? In the ancient world, if you have a lot of daughters that you're trying to marry off and not a whole lot of eligible men to marry them off to, it makes sense to kill two birds with one stone, as it were. So the law speaks to Israel's situation, and the law provides Israel with moral instruction. The law tells Israel, look, this is wrong. And this is something, by the way, that Israel has to confront not long after the lives of the patriarchs. In these laws that we've just read in Leviticus 18, pretty much all of the patriarchs are condemned for sexual sin, at least implicitly, in the things that are forbidden. Right, so the law is providing Israel with some moral instruction. It doesn't just leave them comfortable to do what their pagan neighbors have done and to do what their relatives have, their ancestors have done. So these kinds of relationships, which might seem convenient to Israel in their ancient context, are not to be pursued, because God is holy and Israel is to be holy. Now, that's the last thing that we're going to look at out of the law today. I think we're drawing up near to our normal amount of time that we spend for a Bible class. So just to keep the editing on this video manageable and get this out in a timely fashion, we're going to take a break on our study there. So if you're recommending this video to somebody, please don't tell them, hey, I've got this great video about incest I want you to watch. Just tell them it's about the law of Moses. But next week, Lord willing, we will move away from the incest laws and start looking at some of the other restrictions that we read in Leviticus 18. In fact, bringing us past the incest laws brings us up to a really interesting restriction that we don't talk about a whole lot. This restriction against having sex during menstruation. Like, what on earth is that about? Beginning with that law, we're going to see the connection in the law of Moses between sexuality and uncleanness. And we're not going to just look at the law against menstrual sex. We're also going to studying that connection is going to take us back into Leviticus 12 and the cleanliness laws concerning birth. We'll go to Leviticus 15 and the laws concerning discharges. And that will hopefully help us understand a little bit of where the law of Moses is coming from and the connection between these things and the moral teaching that's going on in the law of Moses. So until then, until next week, I hope that you all do well. Hope that you stay clear of COVID-19 and that God continues to bless you and watch over you. If you're watching this on YouTube, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. That really helps the channel out, helps us to get our message in front of more people. Make sure to share this video with your friends. Again, don't tell them, hey, I've got a great video about incest for you. I mean, you've got enough common sense not to do that. But again, we'll pick up on our study of the law next week. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.